Good afternoon, everyone. We are group 6 and we'll be looking at domestic abuse. My group members are Tonya, myself, Purnima, Emily, and Chitanjali. Our group has looked at 3 articles to support the background of the study, one of which covers what is domestic abuse, the types. The second article was based on statistical findings on how it affects women, and the last article was based on what leads to domestic abuse. The types of domestic abuse are physical, emotional, sexual, and economic abuse. This is a summary of the 3 articles. Domestic abuse is also known as domestic violence. It is a behavior in any relationship that is used to gain or maintain power and control over an intimate partner. It affects persons from different socioeconomic backgrounds and educational levels. There are many forms of domestic abuse. According to Moses, on the 18th of December 2021, the University of Guyana finds that the incidence of domestic violence by an intimate or previous intimate partner in Guyana increased by 74.8% in 2011 and 89% in 2017, with more than 80% of the victims being female. This is one of the major problems in many societies. We chose this topic to raise the awareness and help women in our society today who are facing domestic abuse. The purpose of this study is to determine the effects of domestic abuse on its victims and how the victims of domestic abuse can be assisted. Research questions. The first one, what are the effects of domestic abuse on women? The second question, how can victims of domestic abuse be assisted? Instrumentation. This research is aimed to collect both qualitative and quantitative research data. However, only primary data collection method was used, namely interviews and questionnaires. 50 questionnaires were distributed, which had a total of 4 bipolar questions, which were given randomly. The interviews were used to gather data from 5 villagers with the use of 3 structured questions in a time frame of 5 to 10 minutes while being recorded, which was used to investigate the issue in depth. Sampling. The research was based on domestic abuse of women in Maibikuri Blackbush polder. The questionnaires and interviews were distributed on the 28th of May 2021. Population. In this study, the population was consisted of residents of Maibikuri Blackbush polder. These residents were both male and female of varying socioeconomic background, ethnicity, and religious background. It, however, consisted of persons from different age groups. Thank you. I will now hand you over to my other colleague.
Analysis and discussion. Data collected from the questionnaires and interviews were analyzed through the use of graphs and tables. 2 questions were analyzed from the interview, whereas the 3 questions were analyzed from the interview. The first figure, which is a bar graph, depicts the physical and mental consequences of domestic abuse on women. It reflects that all the respondents agreed that physical abuse in the form of bruises is a consequence of domestic abuse on victims or survivors. Likewise, all the respondents chose suicidal thoughts or attempts. It depicts that 14 respondents of the sample population chose hopelessness, while 9 respondents chose sadness. The same number of respondents identified involuntary shaking and depression as consequences of domestic abuse on women. A total of 6 respondents identified anxiety as another consequence. However, 3 respondents indicated that there are other consequences of domestic abuse on women that was not given as an option. For the second figure, it's a pie chart which displays the number of responses and how domestic abuse mostly affect the lives of abused women. It reflects on 53% of respondents who agreed that domestic abuse forces women to leave their homes. 20% of the sample population indicated that women are unable to retain employment because of domestic abuse. Abuse of alcohol and other drugs was selected by 7% of the sample population, because they believed that women's lives were mostly affected that way. Likewise, 7% chose women were mostly affected in terms of constant failure. The remaining 13% indicated that women mostly self-isolate themselves because of domestic abuse. Figure 3, which is a column graph, depicts the responses from interviewees when asked to list some health complications abused women experience. 4 interviewees indicated that chronic pain was a health complication experienced. One of the interviews mentioned that this complication was a result of the constant physical abuse. Broken bones was another complication suggested by 4 interviewees. Emphasis was placed on unplanned pregnancy as a health complication by 3 interviewees. This was due to sexual assault by their intimate partner. Likewise, sexually transmitted diseases was another complication indicated because of this type of abuse. An interviewee mentioned eating disorder as a health complication. This disorder was due to the lack of food. Figure 4 is a pie chart. It displays the responses from interviewees when questioned on how the community treats victims or survivors of domestic abuse. 40% of the interviewees mentioned that the community offers physical help. This can be done by providing financially or providing a safe place. And interviewers spoke about emphasizing the these abused women as a form of comfort. 20% of the interviewees mentioned that the members of the community suggest places these abused women can go to feel safe. However, an interviewee emphasized that the few members of the community blame the victim of abuse and not the abuser. Figure 5 is a bar chart portraying the responses from interviews when asked on what can be done to assist victims or survivors of domestic abuse. 5 interviews mentioned that the abusers should have stricter penalties. A total of 4 interviews indicated that assistance can be given to victims or survivors of abuse by training abused women to become independent. An interviewee emphasized that victims or survivors can be trained in sewing, cake decorating, and computer classes. Providing a safe place for victims or survivors were mentioned by 3 interviews. It was indicated that by an interview that this safe place will be beneficial when the victim or survivor was ready to leave their abusive household. Likewise, 2 interviews mentioned counseling services for these victims or survivors of abuse. Thank you. I'll now hand you over to my next colleague.
Recommendation. The first recommendation states that you should educate the community so that they can identify the signs of domestic abuse. The community leader should have small groups where members teach each other about the signs of domestic abuse. Some signs of domestic abuse is when a person have excuse on injuries, a personality change like low self-esteem, a lack of money, or overly worried about pleasing their partners. Educating the community on these signs would be helpful because if they notice individuals showing these signs, they can ask if anything is wrong, listen to them, let the person know that they're always there for them, to talk to them, and their conversation will always be private. Offer to help and support the person's choice. When victims know that there are persons there who are interested in their problem and wants to listen to them, they will feel comfortable to share their problems. The second recommendation states they should teach women self-defense skills. Teaching women self-defense skills like basic martial art technique, how to break free from an abuser, or using their voice as a weapon for resistance benefits in many ways that extend beyond discovering how to protect themselves. This helps by boosting their self-esteem and positively affect their personality. This can also be done by having classes to teach these women these skills. The third recommendation states provide centers or homes for battered women. This can be done by having a specific housing scheme dedicated specifically for homeless women. Domestic violence is one of the leading causes of homelessness for women, both women and their children. By doing this, it will help these injured women feel safe and they can begin to rebuild their lives. The fourth recommendation states train women to be independent by teaching them culinary skills. This can be done by having cooking classes where they teach women new recipes or the rules on how to handle food properly. From this, they can have jobs as food vendors, or they can open their own bakeries where they make cake and sell to make a living. Learning these culinary skills, women will gain their own money, and gaining their own money will make them feel independent. In conclusion, the acquired result from the questionnaires and interview demonstrated what the effects of domestic abuse were and how victims of domestic abuse can be assisted in Mabikuri Flatbush folder. Majority of the respondents agree that physical abuse is the main effect or consequence of domestic abuse on victims or survivors. Physical abuse comes in the form of bruises on the body. From the interview, about 40% interviewees agree that victims of domestic abuse can be assisted by providing finances or a safe place for them to reside. In addition, another 20% of the interviewees suggested that victims can be sympathized with as a form of comfort. Therefore, it can be seen what the effects of domestic abuse is and how victims of it can be assisted. I will now hand you over to my next colleague.
Good afternoon. Ways ways on how to improve the study. Keep it simple. When it comes to research, it is easy to get lost in the maze that is your paper. But there is real value in keeping it simple. It'll make your work more accessible to others and therefore hopefully more popular. Secondly, look at the manuscript as an outsider. As you write the manuscript, keep in mind that someone who is not as involved in your study as you will be reading the manuscript. Therefore, write the manuscript precisely and clearly and convey the key story without repetition and without over interpretation. Keep it simple but effective. Avoid using jargons or decorative language, and also avoid sexist, racist, or overly informal language. In broadening a research topic, it is impossible to look for other opportunities, expand analysis by means of using resources available to the general public. However, a researcher should never assume that the original research problem is defined too narrowly when beginning the process of seeking suitable or meaningful information to support the study. It is important to turn for help to a librarian before making any assumptions. Librarians can guide scholars to undiscovered research or suggest steps for designing a more extensive analysis of a research problem. In broadening a research topic, a scholar should consider several aspects, such as the potential for examining associate subject, underlying issues, the role of the key players, contributing to research relevancy, and solution to the identified problem. Compared to the process of narrowing a study topic, broadening a subject area is less complex because cutting out detail that may be relevant may lead to possible limitation and loss of opportunities to research. Thank you. That's all for me.
This is a list of the reference. Before the presentation ends, I would like to recite the poem. It doesn't matter how rich or poor a person is, what gender or social class, or how much fame or education she possesses. Verbal, mental, and physical abuse can happen to anyone. It doesn't matter what a woman's ethnicity is because the only distinguishing color of abuse is black and blue. By Latoya Jackson.
This is the end of our presentation. Thank you for listening, and these are some references.